Welcome everyone. Good afternoon. Thanks for joining today to talk tarps with us. My name is Ryan Marr. I work as a research and extension specialist in the Cornell Small Farms program, where I work in soil health and reduced tillage practices for vegetables. I'm joined by my counterpart at the University of Maine, Peyton Janakis, where together we have been doing research and on tarping practices and supporting farmer to farmer conversations like this to help you all learn, trial, and develop methods that work for you on your own farm. Today, our theme for this tarp talk is you can't send back your soils and weeds, tarping the problems you are served. We're very grateful to have two farmer speakers today to talk about what tarping looks like on their farm and what problems they're trying to address and where perhaps new problems have emerged. I want to welcome those farmers, At.Maryellen Sheehan from Hartwood Farm in Chittenango, New York, as well as At.David McDaniel from Dharma Farm in Jackson, Maine. Now our plan over this next hour is to have each farmer speak for about 20 minutes, leaving us about 20 minutes for question and answer session. So I ask that you pile your questions using the chat box, and we will address those as we get towards the third section of our webinar. Please do use the chat and put your questions in there, and we will get to them, and we will use them to fuel our discussion. Also, please do stay muted and with your video off to preserve bandwidth and keep our connection clean. And lastly, on the logistical side of things, we are recording this webinar along with the previous two webinars that we have offered the month of March here. Those will be available on the Small Farms Program YouTube channel. So direct your farmer, neighbor, friends, and others to find them there. Lastly, I want to acknowledge our funding for all the work that we do. Northeast SARE supports both these kinds of farmer to farmer workshops, as well as the research that we're doing in New York and Maine. I also want to acknowledge the USDA and the Hatch program and the Northeast IPM Center for making these events possible. With that, I want to invite At.Maryellen to share her screen and get us started.
Okay. Am I going? You guys can see this?
I can see that. You are good to go.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm At.Maryellen from Hartwood Farm. And I wanted to start off with the current scene in our fields. That's enough of that. So I wanted to start off with that because we've been experimenting with tarping over the winter. And so that's a lot of what we've been dealing with the last 2 years of trying this. Okay, now I can see. So we're up in Fenner, New York. So we are one ridge over from a major wind farm installation. We've been growing here for about 10 years. And it's definitely been a more interesting cropping situation than where we grew previously, which was in the Hudson Valley and New Hampshire. And so moving here and running a vegetable farm, we had initially planned on doing 20 or 30 acres, but just the elevation challenge has been a lot. We generally get snow well into May. We can't get planting in the ground really until May 1st here. And then we're starting to get freezes and snow by the end of September. So this has been kind of like the backdrop as we've been evolving our farm systems and how we can push and have a CSA, but also guarantee it and protect the soil. So we've been trialing a lot of things, and I'll be showing a lot of pictures of those. So just a little bit about like how we manage our farm. We have 70 acres total, and we're growing on our field area is 35 to 40 acres, and we have a 1 acre pond and about 5 acres of wetlands. And we grow actively on 5.5 acres about each year. And then we have another 5.5 acres in cover crops. So our goal each year is to completely switch from one set of fields to another. So we kind of rotate our entire production from the back side of the farm to the front side of the farm. And we started doing this because we can't get compost reliably here. So for fertility, cover crops is basically our main way to add fertility. So we've been able to explore like longer season cover crops and breaking up a lot of weed cycles. So it's been nice for the farm to have that land buffer. But within the 5 acres we grow on, we do 6-foot bedded crops and pretty intensive production. You can see a few more pictures around the farm. We get between 12 and 17 feet of snow each winter. So in the upper right, you can see that's one of our greenhouses has been dug out, but the other one is under the snow. So snow is a constant pressure. Our average wind speed is around 15 to 20 miles an hour on a good day. So like we're always dealing with the wind and the pressure on the greenhouses and high tunnels. When we first moved to the farm, we have some really nice flat ground, about half of our fields, but we have so much humidity here and there was so much flooding. The fields that we planned on using that are these nice flat fields would basically just fill up with water every summer. So you can see our tomatoes there just struggling. So over the years, we've gradually been moving our production to the upland side of the farm. So like in the bottom left corner, we farm mostly in half-acre plots that all have a slight cant. And that's been helping us with like water drainage during extreme storms, but it also opens our soils up for more erosion. So that's where we started doing more of the cover cropping and the tarps. And I'm the person that takes like pictures of all the horrible things on the farm. So I put a picture of vegetables in that we actually do successfully grow vegetables despite all the bad pictures I'm going to show. So we do, whoops, sorry, Ryan. Is there a way to get the top bar out? I can't see my titles.
You can't see your titles, so maybe adjusting your
I'll
use.
just, you guys can see the titles. I'll just try to remember.
Yeah,
So these are the different situations that we're trying to use tarps on our farm and kind of what we're trying to manage with those tarps. So our 2 main setups would be like on the top right, just using tarped large areas for direct seeded crops. And then the bottom right, after the last workshops, just when people were talking more about landscape fabric, I did add in like how we use landscape fabric on our farm because we found that to be at least as valuable, if not more valuable than the tarps in terms of production. So our main thing is where we get these really tight weather windows where we might only have like 5 to 10 hours in the spring where like we just get these crazy wet springs. So we might get 5 or 10 hours where the ground is workable. And then we might not have workable ground for 3 or 4 weeks. And so everything on our farm now is getting aimed at working as much ground as we can in that extremely tight window and then protecting it in a way that it's not eroding or compacting and we can plant on it over the next month. And that's where we started to do the tarps was as raincoats. So we either will prep a lot of beds and put tarps on them, or if we don't have time to prep all the beds and they're almost dry, we'll actually cover the beds, the ground with tarps to keep it from getting wet so that we can work it at our leisure when we pull the tarps off. So it's definitely like a lot of labor, but it lets us get, you know, an acre of the 5 or 6 acres we're going to use. We can potentially prepare an acre and plant in that over the next month. And so we've also been trialing, like, can we increase our nutrients in the field if we use tarps over cover crops over the winter so they're not leaching? And can we plant earlier in the year than May? And so the types of tarps we use on the farm is we use both the landscape fabric in the 4 and 6 foot widths, though after the last one of these tarp talks, I'm kind of interested in trying that in like a 15-foot width and seeing if that water permeability is helpful for beds that we've already prepared. And then we use both 20 and 24-foot silage tarps. And we use those to cover 3 beds at a time. So the 20 feet doesn't quite cover 3 beds for us, and the 24-foot doesn't quite cover 4. So we're kind of trying to figure out that sweet spot. And then we do use a fair amount of single-use plastic mulch on the fields. We aren't really big fans of it, but we feel like in our area, if we're going to guarantee our CSA members shares, like we need to have some plastic down. And our county used to recycle all of this plastic, but they've changed from public recycling to private, and now they say our plastics are too dirty. So we're trying to find things that we can use more years than just one. So of the 3 different ways that we're using the tarps on the farm, about half of it's for direct seeded crops. And we have tarps, our tarps are 100 feet long, and our beds range from 150 to 225 feet, depending upon the shape of that field, like as we work with the land. So we have some of the tarps are cut into shorter lengths, like a 50-foot length or a 25-foot length. And so we spread out the tarps, like in the top left picture, we've prepped those beds and we've got them all tarped. So that's for the first like month of planting brassica greens on the farm. On the top right would be tarps off to the right there for carrots. And then we're seeding into ground that we had tarped before. And then down in the bottom would be stuff that's been growing on the tarp ground. For these crops that we direct seed, depending upon like if we get the timing right and we have the tarps down for like a full 3 weeks and it's warm, we might not have to weed anything at all, or we might just have to weed like 1 or 2 times. So that bottom left picture is a crop failure, but a tarp success, I would consider. It's from last year. It's in our weediest field on the farm, and it's where we had tarped for carrots. And so we prepped the ground, we tarped it for 3.5 weeks. We pulled it back, we seeded carrots. And so the carrots, if we use pelletized seed, we have a problem with our earthworms eating our seed. So we didn't get a good enough stand of carrots there, but that was ground that was watered twice a day under row cover for 4 weeks without being weeded. And that's the amount of weed pressure that we have, which I would consider really successful. And if we had had carrots germinated, that would have been something pretty easy for us to take care of. And then this is looking at our overwinter tarp trials here. On the top left, you'll see that's from 2020. And so that was one of our first overwinter trials. Because we use a lot of cover crops and we do most of our stuff transplanted, we kind of are comfortable with a fair amount of debris in the field. So we don't really clean, our beds aren't really clean and shiny usually when we're planting into them. So we covered that with tarps over the winter so it didn't leach, and the cover crop kind of mellowed out a bit. And then we took the tarps off, prepared the beds in our early spring window, which we had a brief window we could work the ground in March because it was so dry with the tarps and it warmed up. We formed the beds and we put the tarps back on and then planted into it at the end of April. So that worked really well, and we had good production there. And that's actually like one of the less good spots of the field. So we definitely felt like it held a lot of the nutrients in. On the bottom right, you can see we're midway through that process where we had the tarp on as a raincoat. We took it off and chiseled the bed so that it would dry out a bit more. And then we're putting the tarp back on so that it would keep weeds from germinating. And then the bottom left field is the field that I had the video of in the beginning. We tarped off a full half-acre field for our early crops this year, and just kind of dealing with it in the wind this spring, early spring has been interesting. I have more on that one later. This is our second system, and I have pictures of the whole, like kind of in a circle from the top left of the whole part of the system of how we're using the landscape fabric on the farm. And this is where we do use plastic culture for the Solanaceae and the cucurbits. They just grow so much better if they're on plastic here. And we've tried it a few different ways, and it's just like double to triple the yield if we do this. So we plant the crops in just the bare ground on the aisles there. And then you can see we're laying out the tarp or the landscape fabric, and then we seal it all up with the hoops and row cover. And just on pests, we have a lot of organic grain and dairy farms around us. And so we just have a lot more organic pests than one would think on a vegetable farm at our elevation. So we do have to use a lot of row cover. In the bottom right, as they start to flower and about the time where they're going to start running, we pull the row cover off. And you can see the landscape fabric. There's pretty much no weeds in the system. And we do leave some of the rock bags on just because we are so windy that we leave a rock bag like every 20 feet or so. In that middle picture, when we're pulling it off on our cucurbits, you can see we've been experimenting with using the row cover hoops to help hold down the tarps instead of using like pins. And it's working pretty good if you do the hoops vertically along the bed, but it's harder to do the row cover on and off. If you have the hoops vertically, it kind of snags the row cover. And in the bottom left, you can see we have a few weeds in that picture, but pretty much it's like a weed-free field after we pull out those tarps. And so we try to use it strategically. This year that field's in cover crops, but then next year we'll be able to use hopefully smaller seeded crops there since we tried to eradicate a lot of weeds over the season. And the third place we use the tarps that we're kind of experimenting with is on our brassicas, which is a lot of our production. Probably 2 acres is in brassicas. So the top picture, you can actually see our wind farm off in the distance, but the left side of the beds, you can kind of get a sense of how we're moving around the tarps for the small brassicas. So we have 3 of those 4 little zones planted, and the last one is getting ready for that last planting. And where we use the tarps in our brassicas is because we have so many flea beetles and Swede midge here, we pretty much have them under row cover all the time. So ideally, we're putting the tarps down where the row cover, where we call it's like the zipper for the row cover. And so that way, when we're weeding, we can just like pull it off and pile everything on those aisles on top of the tarps and not have to deal with weeding around rock bags. And just the bottom 2 pictures on the left is we try to be zen about the weeds. If they're not affecting our yields, our harvest isn't slowed down by them, and they're not going to go to seed, we kind of just like let them live in the aisle. So we have a few fields that are fresher out of sod or that we had in sod or pasture. And so we do get a fair amount of grass coming through and we just kind of ignore it. So that's in the bottom left. But the bottom right is this last season, we ran out of landscape fabric for the aisles. So we had a few that we did not cover where the rock bags are. And it just became like a nightmare scene of weeds. So the bottom right is a picture of why we're using the tarps there. And then just on our smaller, like high tunnels where it's smaller, we do a lot of like what the last 2 workshops we're talking about, where if we do the cover crop, we'll either cover it with that landscape fabric or we'll weed whack it and cover it. And then during the summer in the bottom right, the whole area is landscape fabric. And so it's pretty clean. You can see on the left, like it's definitely over the years run down our weed bank in the tunnels pretty quickly to just always have it covered either in crops or cover crop or tarps. And I put this picture in here because with us having so many systems on the farm where some are using tarps and some aren't, there's definitely like a planning period where I feel like we have like these crazy looking tarp rotation maps where we're just kind of planning everything out. But we do like have color coding and dating and labeling on all of our tarps. So we're just kind of figuring out like, do we have enough, like, and prioritizing within the group, like who's going to get it, who isn't. And when we're moving it, we try to never have to fold up the tarp. So making sure we're moving a tarp from like one zone over a tarp that's on another zone to the next one, just so we're moving bags and rocks and everything less. And so getting into like managing the tarps in the wind and winter. So we've been at like 55 miles an hour to 60 miles an hour, I should say, the last 3 weeks, it seems like a lot. And for the most part, we keep our tarps down. We do 35-pound rock bags at 2 paces, and we do that on the edges of the tarps and in each aisle. And it actually works pretty good, especially sometimes we do raised beds and sometimes we have like more flat beds. But if you have a more raised bed and you can really get those rock bags like lodged in that little dip, it does seem to help a lot. One thing over the last 2 years, we've really noticed that if our tarps are overlapping, they get like really lubed up when it's like the plastic on the plastic and they tend to slide out. And so we try to minimize the seams where they're touching each other, or at the very least, give them each their own sets of rock bags. And then in the bottom right, you can see on one of our windy fields last year, it was just like so windy that we ended up just piling all the tarps everywhere. And more of the tarp pictures. So top left, you can see that would be like the minimum amount of rocks. Right in the middle there is where an example, we've been leaving the gap. So even if our field is 300 feet long, we're using 100-foot tarps and we're intentionally leaving a gap at the seams. It seems like they stay down so much better in the wind, not having that plastic on plastic. And then when we're moving them, it gives us an area if there's water in the tarps for it to drain. So it kind of creates an area you can't plant into the bed. And an area where there's more weeds, but it also just makes the tarps easier to manage. The top right, you can see anytime we have the landscape fabric and the tarps, like we just leave some rock bags down on it. In the bottom right, I was just showing more pictures of how we're using the hoops to help anchor things. And then we have the rock bags, and then we use even the pins and the staples. So we'll put pins to like the right sides, like where it goes into the plastic, and then we hammer 8-inch staples down in the middle. And then top left, you can kind of see when we're unzipping to harvest, and then we kind of rezip up everything. And then the last few slides, just looking at how we're managing all the rock bags. So we have a lot of rocks. So that's what we're using to fill up our bags. And we kind of color code the bags each year with a different color zip tie. So we know, like, we want to kind of be rotating them, that we're not bringing diseases like black rot from one brassica field to another. So we do kind of pay attention to like what row cover we're using where, what tarps we're using where. We don't go crazy with bed prep, especially for these fall beds. Like, we figure they're going to get hammered on all winter. So we try to leave a fair amount of crop debris like under those tarps. We do this last year, Matt made a bunch of these pallet boxes that we've been using for the rock bags, the tarps, our row cover, pretty much anything that we can palletize. And it's just like the heaviest duty pallets with these little bins that he built up on top. And so that's been helpful. It can carry about twice as many rock bags as the bucket loader, but it can also fit the tarps like folded up. We can put a couple tarps on each of them. And I think we're going with 3-bed tarps for the most part. You can see on the right here, this is how we found it easiest to move them around the field with the tractor. So this was in this last year, the fields that we showed with the wind and everything, as we're laying them out, that one person will go ahead and windrow all the bags. One person's driving the tractor like in a creeper real slow, and then the other person tosses everything on. So, and then we had some conversation in the last one about rodents. We try to keep our grounds, our grass really short and try to encourage predation. Our dog, as you can see, likes to lounge in the tarps, but doesn't do a very good job hunting. But I put a picture of my parents' cat who lives underneath their tarp for their gardens, and she just like eradicates everything underneath it. So I think if you found a really good cat, that might be helpful. But they don't have a single problem with a rodent. And I think that is it.
Thank you, Maryellen. I thought you had some beautiful pictures. They certainly weren't focusing on.
Well, I get in trouble because I just take pictures usually of the disasters.
I was also thinking about 35-pound bags, which is a lot of weight to be hauling around. So
Yeah.
all those details on the logistics are really, really helpful.
And the bags we do, we load them up and they last like a couple years, but then we've been moving them because we have drainage issues to like the roadbed and stuff. So it's kind of like they're transitional. They're very transitional. When they burst open, then they get relocated.
Well, thanks for sharing. We'll encourage folks to put questions for Maryellen and Dave in the chat. Please use the chat, and we're going to get to all of them as after Dave talks. So Dave, I'm going to let you share your screen, and then we'll have discussion.
Can you see that, Ryan?
I can. It looks great.
And can you hear me okay?
I can. Yep. I think you're good to go.
Okay, Maryellen, that was a great talk. And the thing I like the best is when you said, try to be Zen. I thought that was very appropriate. And the name of our farm is Dharma Farm. Let's see. We didn't set out to be farmers. We set out to be homesteaders, and we bought a piece of property in 2007. It was seeded for, it had been clear cut and seeded for wildlife. And that was good in one sense because the gentleman that seeded it for wildlife did a nice job with a pasture mix, and we didn't have any annual weed pressure when we first came here. In 2009, we decided to become commercial farmers on our land, and we became organic certified through MAFCA. And over the years, we've kind of honed down or drilled into what is profitable on our farm, and we're diversified now into some high value vegetable crops that we wholesale, seed garlic, and we have a vineyard, and we do wine grapes wholesale also. We've also truncated our season. So we sell from May 1st to October 31st by choice. Our operation is very small. I think compared to some of the other presenters, we do about $45,000 to $50,000 in gross revenue from the farm a year from vegetables and garlic predominantly. And I've sized everything, so it's pretty much a one-person show. So there's one full-time farmer, that's me, and then we flex up on a payroll, like for a garlic harvest or other things as needed. So about $3,000 or $4,000 in payroll. Our farm, we're not quite as cold. I thought we were cold. After listening to Maryellen, man, we don't have it bad at all. We're zone 5B. Our soils are Tunbridge, sandy loam. We have a pretty good slope, which helps with drainage on our vegetable fields, so about a 1 to 3% slope. We have just under 1.5 acres in vegetable cultivation. We primarily use those for spinach and garlic rotations. We have 4 high tunnels that we use for higher value crops like tomatoes, peppers, and eggplants. Then we have that 2.5 acre vineyard. Now, these are some of the historic practices we did from like 2009 to 2018 before we adopted tarps. We didn't buy this land to farm. In fact, we bought it when it was covered in snow and fell in love with it. And then when the snow melted, we found out we had a lot of ledge. So we ended up setting our fields. We have a whole bunch of fields that are all 45 feet by 100 feet, which is about 1/10 of an acre. I learned from Eric Seidman at Mafka to keep the ground covered at all times, and we did intensive cover cropping, usually like multi-species, like oats, peas, and forage radish. We made a lot of on-farm compost, usually applying about 20 to 40 yards a year. And then these are my tillage implements of destruction. So subsoiler, this 5-foot Kuhn tiller, which is almost indestructible, and a disc harrow. And then another practice that's very important to this talk is we mulch our garlic. We were harvesting about 3,000 pounds of garlic a year, and we winter mulch it. So being new farmers, we didn't think very much when we first bought our mulch, and we brought in a lot of organic hay, and we brought in every weed seed known to man, and brought it in our garlic mulch until we started getting wise. And then this is pretty good. This is straw we're using here, I think, in later years, but the weed pressure went from 0 to incredibly intense. Our soil organic matter went from about 2%. It's up about 7 or 8% now. But as our soil organic matter went up, the tilth of the soil was actually becoming worse, and we were getting some more compaction and hard pan. And part of that is because with all the cover cropping I was doing a lot of tillage. I would till twice and mow and incorporate it with tillage. So we were going over the beds way too much. We also have a lot of problems, as Maryellen said, with late snow melt into April, and the ground's very soggy and wet. We have a lot of trouble getting our tillage equipment on the fields in the spring. And I was getting kind of discouraged with the cost of cover crop seed and fuel, being organic certified buying. You can spend $100 on cover crops on a field in the blink of an eye. So started going through this transition to tarping. I think where I really started thinking about it was with the garlic rotation. We had this period where you plant your garlic in October, and then you don't harvest it till the next following August. And the tilth on those fields was rather dramatic compared to all of our other fields. And then in getting more interested in no-till, in 2015, I went to this wonderful workshop that NOFA put on with Brian O'Hare from Tobacco Road Farm in Connecticut. And he convinced me as a vegetable grower that you can do 100% no-till. And I came back from that presentation, I was all fired up, until I sat down and started figuring out that to change my system, I was going to have to buy a new kind of cultivation tractor to set up permanent beds and a rotary harrow. And the money just really kind of brought me to reality, what it would cost on our farm to convert to a new system. And then I went to 2016, I went to an evening presentation that Mark Hutton with Maine Cooperative Extension did. And I think this was the very first research that Cornell and the University of Maine were doing on tarping. And I saw these side-by-side comparisons of these fields where they had tarped in the weed control, and I was sold. So in 2017, I did my own on-farm trialing. I got 6 mil bunker plastic, black on one side and white on the other, and did side-by-side comparisons of tarping, flame weeding, and conventional tillage. And hands down, the tarps convinced me they were superior. They did almost 100% control of the weeds in my trials. So in 2018, I jumped in full tilt. I bought enough tarps to cover 6 fields. Each tarp was 50 by 100 feet, 6 mil thick. I bought them from Paris Farmers Union, each at $220 delivered. And my hope was to get, and still is, to get 6 to 10 years out of the tarps. So what I want to do now is I want to walk you through a case study with our spinach production and how we converted it to tarping. And I wish I had all kinds of tarping pictures with the spinach, but I didn't know I was going to be doing this tarp to the winter, or I would have taken more pictures. But I think I have enough pictures to tell the story here. So in our area, spinach is a very high value crop. It's about $8 wholesale pre-bagged. And in 2016, some of our wholesale customers asked us to start growing summer spinach, which we did. And what we found out very quickly is our weed pressure was so intense, we actually had to transplant the spinach to make it viable to outcompete the weeds. And it became very expensive and very labor intensive. So in 2018, we converted our entire system to tarping, or spinach production to tarping. And that's what I want to talk about now. So instead of doing fall cover cropping, because we always covered our fields, we would do summer cover cropping. And this is a picture of Sudan grass and soybeans. And then we would till that. And then in the fall, I'd do a soil test, add compost on top of the mowed cover crop, and add any amendments if needed. And then this is similar, I think, to what Mary-Ellen's experimenting with. In October, I would do a single pass with the coon tiller to incorporate and shape our bed. So I went from 5 or 6 passes with the cover crops to a single pass with the coon tiller, and then immediately tarp the fields. So I would never leave that tilled field exposed to rain. And then for the last 3 years, we've kept the tarps in place over the winter. So this picture was taken just last week as the snow is melting off our fields, and this nice warm weather we've just had, and the tarp is there, has been covered all winter long. One thing we still do is the very first succession of spinach, we still do transplant that, and that has to do with soil temperatures more than anything else. So we germinate a set of transplants in our greenhouse, and we direct seed into our tarped fields. So this is where you have to imagine, this is a field last year that we just pulled our tarps off of. This was actually used in vegetable production, but it's identical to what we were doing with the spinach. So what we do is in late spring, this would be in April, we start uncovering the beds that we're going to plant our spinach into. And we do it because of the slope. We plant our tarping, so we're rolling our beds and our successions downhill. So we would literally roll up 100-foot length of tarp down this hill with the tarp. And there's actually the tarp rolled all the way down off this entire field down here to expose only the beds that we're getting ready to plant. And each bed would be 5 feet wide, the width of our coon tiller, by 100 feet long. And again, the first succession was transplanted, but thereafter, we would do direct seeding with a Yang precision seeder. We keep our soil constantly moist and then we have germination within 5 to 7 days. It pops right out. Most of the fields we don't need to do any weeding on with the spinach. I'll talk in a second about some unusual weed pressure. If so, we run the collinear hoe down. We're doing 3 rows of spinach on each 5-foot bed. After 3 weeks, we side dress the spinach. This picture is a spinach bed. This is from 2 years ago. What we're experimenting with here is shade cloth to keep the spinach from bolting in the middle of the summer. And we no longer use that. Last year, we did not use that. What we found is by selecting varieties more carefully, we can prevent bolting. So in the spring and fall, we're using Avon as our primary commercial spinach. And then in the summertime, we're going with seaside spinach from Johnny's. And this seaside does not bolt. It holds really, really well. Every 10 days, we uncover another three beds. So what you're looking at here are 3 beds, another 3 beds, actually, and then there was a leftover bed here. But we're just rolling the tarp downhill and then re-anchoring it and then keeping the tarp in place for weed control. As the spinach growth is slowing down, as the day lengths are shortening, on or about August 15th, we'll actually bank about 6 total beds. That'll be our spinach source into the fall. And then this is the end result. And we had consistent results in 2018, 2019, and last year. So we're harvesting our spinach from May 1st to October 31st. And last year we harvested, and again, this is one person, 2,125 pounds of spinach, and our gross revenue for that single crop was $17,000. And hardly any weeding and no transplanting, and it was actually profitable for us. So Ryan, I'm going to go really quickly through one other crop that I've experimented with. I love corn. It's one of the crops I first started loving to grow when I was a young man, watching my grandfather grow it. When we were doing commercial corn, we would transplant our sweet corn because of weed pressure, but I found tarping works even better. And I do the exact same summer and fall prep the year beforehand. And now I just direct seed the corn with an earthway seeder. Corn pops right up, no weed competition. I just thin it really quick. And if there are any weeds that come up after 3 or 4 weeks, I just run a wheeled glazer hoe through really quick. And we get an outstanding crop with no weed pressure. So the successes that we've had on our farm, this is that same field I showed you uncovered last year. And very little weeding. This is commercial brassicas, and there's a corn crop in the back. So the weeds have been greatly reduced. We've been able to direct seed our spinach without any weed competition. We get on our fields whenever we need to in the early spring because we're not driving our tractor on them. I've had about an 80% reduction in tillage. The soil tilth has improved, and I've greatly reduced my cover crop and fuel expenses. Now, these are my cautions. Some of them are the same that Maryellen went over. And the number one, that video of Maryellen's was fantastic. Our number one problem is wind. And you've got to keep these tots absolutely 100% taut and locked down. In this picture, what I'm doing is I'm doing cinder blocks. We had a lot of leftover cinder blocks from construction. And I do 13 cinder blocks on the side. And I found that even the wind can get under the edges here with the cinder blocks and flip the cinder blocks in the air. And I also have leftover T-posts from when we used to do field tomatoes. And there's a cinder block, there's a T-post, there's a cinder block and a T-post. And using that system, I haven't had any much problems with it blowing away. The second problem I've had, very discouraging, and I don't think other people have talked about this so much, but we have a lot of deer pressure. Our woods comes right up to our fields. And the deer will walk right across these tarps to get at your Swiss chard. And when they walk across them, the hoofs go right through it and can destroy a tarp. So we make sure our electric fences are on as soon as the snow is off. We found because we have this sod around our fields, walkway, there's actually, you get weeds in the summertime right around the edges of your field. And the way I deal with that is I trim it down with a weed trimmer. I go around really, really fast. I'm also concerned about recycling our plastic at the end of its useful life. And what I found is that not every weed is completely controlled. And this surprised me. So these are all the common weeds that we developed in our collection over the years, mostly brought in by straw and hay from mulching our garlic. So we've had excellent control, almost 100% control of hairy gownsoga, chickweed, spotted lacestone, pigweed, purslane, curly dock, and green foxtail. These two, crabgrass and lamb's quarters, have broken through our tarping. They're not as, and they're a little delayed, so the spinach still comes up without them being in the way, but they still come through. And Mark Hutton at a tarp talk, he theorized that maybe some of these weeds might need UV light in addition to the heat and the moisture underneath the tarps to germinate. So I'm wondering if you could just work around the problem with these weeds by maybe pre-exposing them to UV light and flame weeding, and then getting the desired control. And definitely more research is needed. So in summary, we've seen about a 90 to 100% control of our weeds. Tarping is not a complete panacea by any means, mainly because of the wind. You can see these tarps are battened down, but it's a fantastic tool to add to your farmer's toolkit. And I'd give it a solid B+. We couldn't do our spinach actually without it and make it commercially viable. So thank you. And there's my wife. She's the co-owner of the farm, Heather Celine. And I hope I saved plenty of time for questions.
You did very well, Dave. Thank you.
Thanks,
Dave.
That was super insightful and really dense. A lot of nuggets in there to dig into. I really like that that inventory of your weeds. That's impressive. I'd like to hear about how that timeline that you had as far as learning about it and the actual implementation of a trial to see how it would work in comparison to flame weeding. And maybe we could get into that a little bit too. I know Peyton and I have both been keeping an eye on the chat and developing questions ourselves. So I hope that these questions will fuel more questions. And I encourage you all to use the chat to drop any questions for Dave or Maryellen in there as we go. We've got about just over 15 minutes for discussion and Q&A. So Peyton, did you want to start us off with something that you?
Sure. There were a lot of questions, especially for Maryellen, about her cover cropping practices. So Maryellen, would you mind just giving an overview of the species that you use according to different, times of year or different times in your rotation?
Yeah, we do a lot of, one of our problems is like we get out of the field so late or so close to it getting cold. So we've been switching a lot to like triticale from rye. It's just like a little bit easier to manage and a little less crazy in the spring to mow down or till in. But we do either triticale with winter peas or we do generally oats with forage peas. And we usually get them from Lakeview Organic Grain. But we've also been, if we have time and know we're not going to use something, we would maybe mix in some red clover. So the last few years we've had red clover and that's really helped a lot on fertility. And then
you've been able to put that in the fall after your late crops are out?
We'll usually do, that would be like if we messed up on which, like either if we knew that we were going to do it, then we would do like an oats and red clover. Like we've done it intentionally, but we've also like messed up on the timing and then not used the field, but it had oats, so we could put in clover early in the spring. So we've had some times where we've planted. So we have one field this year, we'll probably put red clover in the spring because we thought we were going to use it, we're not, and it had oats. So it'll be like ready to get in there early. And we've done some with buckwheat, but then that became our major weed issue. So we've moved away from buckwheat. We want to do more with Sudan grass. Just seeing David's picture, that looked really nice. We'd like that kind of material. So
great. And then there was a specific question about what cover crop you're using after you showed a picture of the field with a lot of cucurbits in it. But it sounds like probably the triticale. Yeah,
that was triticale and the winter peas.
Great.
So anything that we're getting out later, actually that was triticale. Like anything that we get to a little bit later, it depends like what time we're pulling it out. If we're pulling it out in early September, like through early September, we would do oats and peas usually, and then switch to the triticale.
Maryellen, is it accurate to say that to this point, your tarping ground is not cover cropped? So if you have not combined the two, or like, so tarp ground would be ground that wasn't cover cropped and is bare, but instead is tarped, and then the cover crop is not, it's not going into production the next spring or maybe even the next year. So you have that kind of.
And we did some of our pictures from 2 years ago. We did try, after going to that tarp workshop, when you were talking about some of the studies showing the nitrogen levels being higher if you put a cover crop on after or if you had the cover crop and you tarped it over the winter. We did tarp a bunch of our oats and pea ground, but we just kind of feel like we'd rather prioritize the tarps on the bare ground or the places that we didn't get a good cover crop stand. And kind of thinking when Dave was talking about his soil, like we have a silt loam, so we don't get a lot of erosion across the field, but we get a lot of packing down. So our soil gets really tight really fast. So anything that's open gets packed down. So sometimes we have used tarps in places we might not be planting right away the next year just to keep it from getting packed down.
That was actually one of my next questions for you is how are the tarps that you're leaving on over the winter causing any kind of soil compaction in the spring, especially for direct seeded crops?
That's what we're experimenting with this year.
Okay.
But I mean, the picture, like where all the waves were, where it's really bad, we fixed today. And I mean, our ground was frozen, but it's interesting because we have beds in there that we didn't have enough tarps for. And those ones that we prepared, those are really hard. Like we could not seed in there, but the ones that have the tarps, I'm pretty sure our ground is still fairly frozen, but they seem to be much more, like have much better tilth. So, but we did intentionally, we just ran a chisel plow and like really quick tilled once. So we intentionally tried to leave a lot of stuff still to break down. So there was a lot of debris and plants in there when we covered them.
Gotcha. Dave, how about you?
Yeah,
I have the same compaction question for you.
So the first year we did it, we pulled back the tarps. The ground looked compacted, and it kind of freaked me out a little bit. The reality is, I kind of refused to retill it, so I just ran the Yang seeder down, and the spinach did fine. So it is slightly compacted, but so it's not real friable when you pull the tarp back, but there's nothing serious with it at all.
Great. Go ahead.
Oh, I just was saying when David was talking about the deer problem, we've actually had really big problems with foxes because they know the voles are in there, and the foxes are really good at like ripping immense holes in the tarp. So I wanted to try like with fusing and melting. We have a couple old tarps now, so I'm going to try to like melt and repair some of the foxholes, but that's been our biggest hole maker. But then they also kill the voles, so.
It's a trade-off.
Dave, I was hoping that we could follow up on your weed issues in the spinach, and in particular, when it comes those really early plantings, you've still found there to be that stale seed bed effect, that benefit, or because sometimes I wonder, and I hear from others that, you know, if they're planting their first crops in, you know, early April and things aren't warming up that much, that they've had limited benefit there. I think it was Rachel Cross a couple of weeks ago talked about how she found that she found that flame waiting helped there because things hadn't quite emerged, or they had emerged and they hadn't died yet. So I'm curious what your impressions on those first plantings are.
So no, that's a good point. I would definitely say as you're rolling exposing the beds, 3 beds, we're doing 3 beds at a time. The first 3 beds that we're transplanting into have probably the poorest weed control. It's still so much better than it would have been if we didn't do the tarping. By the time we get to the second succession that we're doing direct seeding in, the tarp seems to have, it's been on there for probably half of October, most of November, and then it's had probably 4 weeks since the snow melted, and we're getting, but yeah, in the very beginning, it might be a little more weedy, but it's still.
What is your target planting date for that first spinach?
So it's right about mid-April, but we're transplanting, and then we follow it almost immediately. No, we're still doing 10 days later. Then we're doing our first direct seeding, and that first transplant, it's still set back a little bit, but at least it's not competing with the weeds. Let me put it up. Ryan, I did forget something major in my presentation. I want to warn people about, and I think it relates a little bit to Mary Ellen's talk also, because we're both doing this fall bed prep. And 6 years ago, we had a major drought in the fall, and I would not tarp over drought stricken fields. I'm not sure what I would do, but I have in the last 4 years I've been tarping now, I have not had a drought when I covered up the fields. And I don't know if any of the other speakers have commented on that or not. I think it would be detrimental to have dry soil, I mean really dry soil, and cover them up for the winter. I just think that would not do anybody any good.
Yeah, and I don't think it would do you any favors in terms of weed control either. You're not going to stimulate any germination under there.
Yeah,
Maybe irrigation.
We did irrigate, and I think somebody at the first workshop was saying, but we did irrigate this summer before we put on the tarp one of the times, because we just felt like it wasn't going to work.
Definitely. There's another question on here about it looked like using manure to kind of occlude weeds and then tarping over that and kind of the logistics around that. Do either of you have any experience with that type of method?
I do not. When we're putting our it's pretty finished compost on top of the residue from the cover crop, and then incorporating the whole thing in with the tillage pass.
Mm-hmm.
And we have no manure at all.
Maybe you could speak a little bit more toward your fertility then. So Dave, you just mentioned everything's incorporated prior to tarping.
Yep.
You do, there's nothing that's added after the fact, or Mary Ellen, are you doing the same, or does it depend?
Yeah, we do like our full bed prep, and when we do one pass with a reverse tine tiller, so we get a smooth bed top. So that's why it looks like we don't have rocks in our pictures. But we have a fertilizer spreader and are dropping between 1,500 and 2,000 pounds an acre of the pelletized organic chicken manure at bed prep, but that's it.
Ryan, we do side dress the spinach 3 weeks after emergence, and I'm just hand side dressing, going right down the rows really fast.
That's right. I do remember you said that.
And that's we use soybean meal and fishbone meal in a 2-to-1 ratio, and then a very small amount of kelp meal and wollastonite.
Mary Ellen, you brought up this, actually both of you have brought up other issues, other problems that are things to think about that haven't been discussed previously. And one was soil-borne diseases. Mary Ellen, you said you're tracking your sandbags. Are you tracking your tarps from as well? Or
our landscape fabric, we are. So we have like a bizarre amount of soil-borne disease issues on our farm. That's actually one of our bigger problems. And I don't know why, because it's been a problem since year one and there haven't been vegetables here, just a lot of fusarium and stuff. So we actually label and rotate all of our landscape fabric because it's being used on the crops. So like it's being used on crops that we know we have diseases with, like the gummy stem blight and stuff. So we'll rotate that just like we do the field. So like we wouldn't use or we sanitize it. Like this year, we're actually going to sanitize everything since it's warm and we have more space. So we would run it through like Sanidate before we use it. But yeah, the rock bags, we're just kind of trying to keep them, like if we use them with brassicas in the first planting of fall brassicas where we know we're starting to get black rot, we would try not to use those bags. We put them in an own box and it wouldn't go on the later brassicas. So, but we have like the black rot is a big problem. So anything that gets used with the brassicas, we try to be more careful. But on the tarps, we figure because we've prepped the ground and they're slicker and they're on longer, we're kind of hoping that any disease issues, it would be on the underside and it's getting hot, would hopefully not transmit. So we haven't sanitized those. And hopefully we're not spreading black rot around our farm.
That's a great point that I had never considered before.
It's my paranoia. Because
understandably.
we've had, of the last 9 years, we've had 2 years where we've lost 100% of our large brassicas in the fall from black rot. And we're like really careful and on top of it, and we still can lose them. So. I don't know if David have you had any disease issues?
No, I'm cringing. No, we worry about white rot and bloat nematode in our garlic, but we don't we grow all of our own seed and have for the last 12 years. You're making me worry about my brassicas though. I've never, I don't have black rot in them, and I hadn't thought about dragging. If I did get an outbreak, that would be how you could spread it from one field to the other.
And no problems on the spinach either, Dave?
No, actually, we have had absolutely no disease pressure. We do a 3-year rotation though before the same crops going in the same field.
Good.
And what's your rotation for the brassicas, Mary-Ellen? You said you have a lot of them. Are you able to have?
Yeah, and that was part of when we first started, we only had like 5 acres and we were using the same ground each year. So it took us like several years. So we don't grow vegetables. We always do vegetable cover crop. So we're already breaking it up. And then we try to do like 4 years on top of that. So especially with the brassicas, we try to have like 5 years at least between them. We're less concerned about like the small direct seeded brassicas, and we buy resistant, like the seed resistance. If we can, we buy those varieties.
Gotcha.
I just saw somebody made a comment about the Bloomsdale spinach, which we've tried. I actually like the taste of the Bloomsdale. It's open pollinated. It's wonderful. Commercially, we have to bag our spinach and spin it dry. And the Avon is Savoyed. It's got the crinkles, but the Abundant Bloomsdale and the Winter Bloomsdale we found is so Savoy crinkly that we can't spin all the water out. We actually have to double spin it. And it's a absolutely, I didn't see who made the comment in the chat, but it's a great variety, open pollinated variety of spinach.
It's a good note.
We just have about a minute left before we sign off. So I'm going to paste in an evaluation here before folks sign off to give us some feedback and to help us, design future workshops and webinars that fit your questions and your needs, and also try to pull in other speakers to feature for those. So please follow that link. I wanted to keep it open to Mary-Ellen or Dave if there was anything else that we haven't talked about, ideas or on your mind before we sign off.
What about your best tip for handling tarps? Like, do you need 2 people? Do you need a team?
If you can get so my tarps are 100 feet. So quickly, I found that first bunch of tarps I bought were odd shapes, and I had them at 24 feet in scraps. And I found the more pieces I had, the more wind would get under. That's why I went with the 50 by 100. If I can get one person, my wife out to help, or somebody to help, it goes a lot smoother. Otherwise, I wait till a completely calm day. I pre-position all the cinder blocks around using pallets and my tractor forks. And I'm just really thoughtful of, you can't pull the tarp tight if there's more than 2 or 3 mile an hour winds. You just need a calm day to do it. When I'm all done, my tarp is in a big long sausage roll. I can drag it over my shoulder as long as it's not uphill. If I have to go uphill with the tarps, I actually wrap a couple of wraps of chain around and just drag it with my tractor very carefully. And I do exactly what Mary-Ellen does. I have a chart of where my tarps are going each season. So I have a tarp plan. That was great.
We try to use 3 people with the tarps if we can, like 3 or 4, and 1 person can be on the tractor and 3 people can move. But one thing I did this year I didn't say is I've been timing how long it takes to fix the tarps between windstorms, like where it looks like that picture, the video I took the other day, it looked really terrible, but it took me 22 minutes to fix it. And so that's helped me be less stressed about it, because it might look terrible, but 22 minutes is like not a big deal.
It's worth it.
Yeah.
Awesome. Awesome. Well,
Great.
thank you
Well,
both.
I want to honor the time. Thank you, Maryellen and Dave, for sharing. Those are two really dense talks. A lot of information in there. I think people will find it really valuable. I learned a tremendous amount myself, and so I'm looking forward to future discussions that we can hold. This is the last of our series this March, and I wish everyone the best this growing season as things start to get ramped up. And thank you all for joining.